This is all a really serious, powerful advantage that the Democrats have learned to weaponize against Republican voters. So why did the GOP underperform on Tuesday? It's the key question, but most analysis that I am reading I find is too compromised by conflicts of interest to be meaningful. In many cases, it is furnished by the establishment type actors who actually bear a huge amount of responsibility for the failures, for the party's inability to do a whole host of things that actually really matter in the course of winning elections. So for their part, the establishment GOP apparatus did exactly what they always do: squander transformative, disruptive energy through a combination of complacency and incompetence. And now they have developed a propaganda campaign to displace their own failures onto President Trump and a number of other factors. But my focus is to clarify the structural factors and predictable messaging failures that explain the GOP underperformance in a much more convincing way than their attempts to displace their own failures. So, accept this, and future strategy can be developed around accurate expectations of how our party infrastructure is going to behave. Plainly, the party has not contended with structural factors that make it an unfathomably hostile environment for anyone who gives the right-leaning half of our country a voice. Nearly all theories of Tuesday's disappointments are unconvincing case studies in projection and delusion, with the funniest that I've encountered being advanced by business-as-usual extraction class types blaming President Trump unjustly for their own failures. And this comes so soon after he single-handedly revived their own party from life support, endured their profound betrayals for years, and as the lone voice on key issues, formed an energized, victorious voter coalition to steer the country's trajectory away from certain death by globalization. But that's the thanks you get in Washington. The explanations that have been advanced by all of these different actors coming out of Washington, D.C. quickly become marginal when you accept that structural factors like the Democrats' masterful ballot harvesting operations and mail-in ballot collection activities do not discriminate based on policy program or personality. We have to contend with the structural factors before we can even turn to our own side's candidates or anything else. So what the country needs now is vision, but we must study the past to make some notes for next time. So let's get into it. Number one, the Democrats' massively fortified, unscrupulous mail-in ballot and ballot collection operations have gone entirely unanswered by the GOP. And this is obviously the most important factor in elections going forward. After 2020, when they used the pretext of COVID to usher in highly liberalized mail-in ballot laws and policies, it has been very, very difficult for the GOP to advance any meaningful opposition to that because it is simply a flood by volume, flood by chaos tactic to subsume election procedure. We are witnessing that going on in Arizona as we speak, where they keep insisting that they cannot count ballots properly. They cannot count ballots in a timely way. This is all a really serious, powerful advantage that the Democrats have learned to weaponize against Republican voters. And it should concern the public that quote-unquote ballot collection has supplanted any recognizable form of campaign strategy for the Democratic Party. This is why you see them refusing to do debates, why you see them refusing to repudiate Biden's unpopular agenda. They do not worry about policy, about optics. They don't worry about anything that you would typically associate with standard campaigning anymore because their strategy is entirely hinging on ballot collection, and especially with mail-in ballots. So allow me to remind listeners of a case study that exposed how jealously they guard this powerful advantage. And this is going to seem potentially really small and irrelevant because it happened in 2018, but I use this as a form of instruction because it's significant of a greater tactic and a part of a greater strategy that Democrats use to subsume elections for their favor. So in the 9th District of North Carolina in 2018, it was a race for a House seat in the U.S. House of Representatives, and Republican candidate Mark Harris had appeared to win the election by 905 votes. Then, a couple weeks later, when the State Board of Elections was doing their standard election certification process, they shocked the country by refusing to certify the result. And Politico wrote that a Democrat on the board, Josh Malcolm, of a county very close to this district where the race was taking place, piped up during the certification meeting saying, "I'm very familiar with unfortunate activities that have been happening down in my part of the state, and I am not going to turn a blind eye to what took place." Then Politico writes, hours later, 5 Democrats and 4 Republicans on the board returned from a closed session and voted unanimously to certify the election results throughout the state with a fairly big exception, the 9th district. So apparently, this gentleman was familiar enough with the quote-unquote unfortunate activities in his region that may have tainted a close Republican win, but miraculously, they are unanimously confident in the election integrity of the rest of the state, that they had Mark Harris, the Republican candidate, investigated in a disproportionately vigorous show trial for what I believe to be the world's most pathetic ballot harvesting operation, conducted by a well-known local operative who, by all accounts, had been manipulating elections in this exact same manner through illegal absentee ballot operations at scale and for hire by both parties in this region for a decade and a half. Per the New York Times, in their write-up of this situation, this operative would pay destitute associates $3 for every collected absentee ballot request and $2.50 for each collected absentee ballot in this rural North Carolina district where the median income was $36,000. In a dramatic and rare let that be a lesson to you move, the state board overturned the election and ordered a new one. This is very, very rare and very, very serious. And of course, the media delighted in humiliating Harris, the Republican candidate, and in drawing special attention to the fact that here was a Republican caught in a ballot harvesting scandal after North Carolina Republicans had long warned of rank voter fraud in the state. But I just want to give a backstory for what was going down for many years in this area. The New York Times wrote that Mark Harris, the Republican candidate, had learned about the activities by this operative that he employed, who had a felony record and a reputation, quote unquote, for shadowy work with Democratic and Republican politicians. In the New York Times write-up, they explained to readers that the operative used a quote unquote 2-phase effort that concentrated on absentee ballots to help put candidates' races over the line for victory. This operative and his associates would quote-unquote help voters submit requests for absentee ballots, an ordinary and legal political activity in North Carolina. But in the second phase of his operation, workers would ensure that voters had received the ballots and would inquire whether they needed assistance. But under no circumstances, apparently, were the workers to collect the ballots. So that's what this operative was hinging on. He would claim that he was simply helping people request their ballots and then maybe offering them a little bit of assistance, but then he certainly was not harvesting the ballots and dropping them off, which later on in the New York Times article they reference he was truly actually doing. But what's interesting here is not just that Mark Harris, the Republican candidate in this particular race, was employing this shadowy operative to run this ballot harvesting scandal, but over the years, as the New York Times writes, Democrats and Republicans alike in North Carolina courted this operative, who, over almost 15 years, went from being a registered Democrat to unaffiliated to Democrat to unaffiliated to Republican. They fraternized with him. They hired him to work his magic in service of boosting their vote tallies. They did so even though local news reports going back to at least 2010 noted his criminal record, which included felony convictions for perjury and fraud. And they did so despite long-standing rumors that his get-out-the-vote tactics were unsavory at the least and perhaps illegal. Quote, "I only knew of him that he was crooked as far as elections are concerned, and he had a way of doing it and avoided prosecution and that kind of thing," said Ben Snyder, the chairman of the Bladen County Democratic Party. So it's really astonishing to me that everyone in this area knew exactly what this man was doing, and somehow he was protected in a way. He was clearly avoiding prosecution. He was avoiding media scrutiny, and it boggles the mind that The New York Times go on to feign ignorance of the probable ubiquitousness of this type of operation that could be going on all around the country when they go on to describe this operative. He was known as the quote-unquote guru of elections in that area, and he was using common electioneering tactics that meld the questionable but legal quote-unquote voting help with outright illegal ballot harvesting and fixing. And he was doing this for years, and they go on to sweetly describe his well-protected, felonious ballot harvesting operations as a, quote, do-it-all vote facilitating business that was part of the community fabric. And then they continue to say, while cash-driven voter turnout efforts are a cottage industry in campaign seasons, Mr. Dowless's operation appeared to run like a family business that crossed lines laid out in election law. It's interesting to me that the country's biggest newspaper was comfortable describing this activity so cavalierly as a quote-unquote cottage industry that's quote-unquote part of the community fabric. And yet only this particular ballot harvesting situation that put over Mark Harris, the Republican candidate, over the line to win his race by 900 votes or so, that this was the particular one where they cracked down, made a giant show trial, and then escalated it with the State Board of Elections through the rare step of ordering an entirely new election, despite their longstanding knowledge that elections in the region were tainted by this particular operative and this particular method for years. Obviously, I am citing this anecdote because it is relevant to how Democrats in running elections have learned to protect their structural advantage with mail-in ballots and absentee ballot hijinks by cracking down so hard and so fast on Republican efforts to play the game by Democrats' rules. Obviously, nobody should be doing this. I am completely anti-ballot harvesting, and frankly, our elections have been corrupted beyond public trust by mail ballots, which is the bigger issue here. The point is, this operative was so well known that the New York Times was citing him as the, quote, guru of elections in this area. So they knew about this for a very long time, and they only resorted to something so severe and so serious as overturning election results when a Republican candidate wised up to how the game was being played. Multiply this brazen manipulation across all of the nation's districts and counties, and you can only guess how much of this activity is tolerated at scale by compromised public officials and ignored or euphemized by the media.